Alright, picture this with me for a second. You're standing on the edge of a riverbank. The air is hot, the desert stretches endlessly behind you, but right here, by this river, the land is green, fertile, alive. This is the Nile, and without it, none of what we're about to talk about would have ever existed. Egypt isn't just old, it's ancient. And I don't mean a couple hundred years of history, or even 1,000. We're talking about a civilization that thrived for more than 3,000 years. To put that into perspective, when Cleopatra was alive, the Great Pyramid of Giza was already over 2,000 years old. Think about that. The pyramids were ancient ruins to the ancient Egyptians themselves. Now, when most people think of Egypt, they think of mummies, pyramids, and maybe a golden mask or two. But Egypt's story is so much bigger than that. This is the tale of a people who invented writing systems, who mastered engineering before most of the world even had cities, who signed the first known peace treaty in human history, and whose culture influenced the Greeks, the Romans, and honestly, pretty much the entire modern world. And here's the promise. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk through that whole story. From the first farmers planting seeds on the banks of the Nile, to the rise of god kings and pyramid builders, to Cleopatra's dramatic fall, and even all the way up to modern Egypt today. This isn't going to be a boring textbook lecture. Think of it like we're sitting down for a story, the kind of story with twists, invasions, comebacks, revolutions, and larger-than-life characters. Because that's exactly what the history of Egypt is. So, grab your metaphorical time machine, because we're about to travel across 5,000 years of history. And trust me, once you see how Egypt shaped the world, you'll never look at those pyramids the same way again. Let's rewind all the way back to the very beginning, before pharaohs, before pyramids, before hieroglyphs. Prehistoric Egypt. Life in this era was simple. People hunted, gathered, and slowly learned to farm. And it all comes down to one thing: the Nile River. The Nile wasn't just a water source, it was Egypt's lifeline. Every year, without fail, it flooded. At first, that sounds like a disaster. But here's the trick. When the waters receded, they left behind rich, dark soil, perfect for growing wheat, barley, and other crops. Imagine you're a small band of hunter-gatherers living near the desert. Every day is survival. Then suddenly, you discover this strip of land where food practically grows itself once a year. You don't have to wander anymore. You can build a village. You can plan ahead. Archaeologists have uncovered sites like the Fayum culture and the Badarian culture, some of the earliest farming communities in Egypt. These weren't just little camps. They had pottery, tools, and burial practices that already showed hints of the culture Egypt would become. And here's something cool. Even in these early burials, you see objects placed with the dead. Tools, ornaments, food. Why? Because even before pharaohs and pyramids, Egyptians believed in an afterlife. That idea that death wasn't the end, but just the next step, was baked into their culture from the very beginning. By around 4000 BCE, these farming villages were growing larger. Trade networks were forming, and regional cultures were developing their own styles of pottery, tools, and art. Egypt was slowly turning from scattered farming communities into a society. And then, the big leap: writing. Egyptians began experimenting with symbols that would eventually become hieroglyphs. Early records show tallies of grain and goods, basically the world's first receipts. So the next time you complain about paperwork, just remember, the Egyptians invented it. Prehistoric Egypt laid the foundation. Farming, belief in the afterlife, early writing, all the seeds were planted here. The stage was set for something far bigger: the birth of a united Egyptian kingdom. Alright, Now let's jump to around 3100 BCE. This is where Egypt stops being just a land of villages and becomes a true civilization. At this time, Egypt was divided into two regions. Upper Egypt in the south, narrow, mountainous, and closer to the Nile source. Lower Egypt in the north, flat, wide, dominated by the delta where the river fans out into the Mediterranean. Two lands, two crowns, two separate rulers. Then comes Narmer. Sometimes he's called Menes in older texts, but most historians today stick with Narmer. He's the guy credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. And we know this because of the Narmer palette. It's this carved ceremonial stone, and it's basically the world's first piece of political propaganda. On one side, Narmer's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other side, he's rocking the red crown of Lower Egypt. Together, it tells the story. Egypt is united, and Narmer is in charge. With unification came something brand new, the institution of pharaoh. Not just a king, not just a warlord, but a ruler who was seen as both a political leader and a divine figure. The pharaoh was literally the link between humans and the gods. They set up Memphis as the capital, right where Upper and Lower Egypt meet. And they started organizing the state. Taxation, administration, armies, and of course, building monuments. It might not have been as flashy as the pyramids yet, but this was the birth of Egypt as we know it. One kingdom, one ruler, one identity. And from here, Egypt would only grow more powerful. Now comes the era that put Egypt on the map forever. The Old Kingdom, also known as the Age of Pyramids. This was Egypt's first true golden age. Pharaohs were absolute rulers, seen as gods walking the earth. Society was stable, the economy was booming, and with that stability came the ability to build on a scale the world had never seen before. It starts with Pharaoh Djoser. His architect, Imhotep, yes, the same name Hollywood turned into a mummy villain, designed the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. Before this, kings were buried in mastabas, flat rectangular tombs. Imhotep stacked one mastaba on top of another, and suddenly, Egypt had its first pyramid. It was revolutionary. But the real showstoppers came a century later at Giza. Khufu, also known as Cheops, decided he wanted a monument that would make Djoser's look like a sandcastle. So he ordered the Great Pyramid. Around 2.3 million blocks of stone, each weighing several tons, stacked into a structure 146 meters tall. For over 3,800 years, it was the tallest man-made building on Earth. Khufu's son Khafre built the second pyramid and probably commissioned the Great Sphinx, that iconic lion-bodied, human-headed guardian of the plateau. Menkaure, Khafre's successor, built the third smaller pyramid. Together, the three stand as one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history. Now here's the part that always gets twisted. The pyramids weren't built by slaves whipped under the desert sun. Archaeologists have uncovered workers' villages near Giza, with bakeries, breweries, even cemeteries. These people were skilled laborers, well-fed, and part of a rotating workforce. Think of it like national service. Building a pyramid wasn't punishment. It was a badge of honor. But the pyramids weren't just about tombs. They were cosmic. Egyptians believed the pharaoh became a god in the afterlife, and the pyramid was a ramp to the heavens. The alignment of the pyramids with the stars of Orion's belt wasn't an accident. These were carefully planned, deeply spiritual monuments. And it wasn't just the pharaohs. Egyptian society was thriving. Agriculture was organized, trade flourished, and scribes kept meticulous records. Hieroglyphs exploded in use, not just for religion, but for administration. For almost 500 years, the Old Kingdom flourished. Pharaohs were powerful, monuments grew bigger, and Egypt looked unstoppable. But then, like all golden ages, it came crashing down. So what went wrong? The Old Kingdom collapsed around 2181 BCE, a combination of weak rulers, economic strain, and, most importantly, climate change. The Nile floods became unpredictable. When the river didn't flood enough, crops failed. Famine followed. Pharaohs, once seen as gods, suddenly looked powerless. And when the pharaoh loses authority, ambitious local rulers, nomarchs, step in. Egypt fractured into smaller states again. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, wasn't all doom and gloom. Local cultures thrived, art styles diversified, and new literature emerged that reflected the hardships of the time. But compared to the glory of the Old Kingdom, it felt like Egypt had fallen from grace. For about 150 years, Egypt was divided and unstable. But then, once again, the South would rise and restore order. The hero of the comeback was Mentuhotep II from Thebes. Around 2055 BCE, he reunited Egypt and ushered in what we now call the Middle Kingdom. This era was different. The pharaoh was still powerful, but now seen more as a shepherd than an untouchable god. Kings were expected to care for their people, not just command them. The Middle Kingdom saw expansion into Nubia to control resources like gold and trade routes. Huge irrigation projects were built to make farming even more reliable. Egypt wasn't just surviving, it was innovating. But the real treasure of this period is in its culture. Literature flourished. Works like The Tale of Sinna tell stories of exile and homecoming, reflecting human emotions we still understand today. Instructional texts like The Wisdom of Amenemhat reveal what rulers wanted to teach future generations. Art became more realistic too. Statues of Middle Kingdom pharaohs often show them with lined faces and weary eyes, almost as if they wanted to be remembered as human, not flawless gods. For 4 centuries, the Middle Kingdom kept Egypt strong and stable. But once again, new challenges were on the horizon, and this time, they came from beyond Egypt's borders. Enter the Hyksos. Around 1650 BCE, a group of people from the northeast, likely from Canaan, moved into Egypt. Over time, they gained power and eventually took control of the northern part of the country. The Hyksos weren't just invaders, they brought new technology: horses, chariots, advanced bronze weapons. For Egyptians, who were still relying on foot soldiers and simple arms, it was like suddenly being outclassed by an army with tanks. But while the Hyksos controlled the north, Egyptian rulers in Thebes continued to hold the south. And they weren't content to sit back. They learned from the Hyksos, adopting their military technology and preparing for a fight. Eventually, Theban kings like Kamose and Amosai launched campaigns that drove the Hyksos out completely. It was a humiliating chapter, but it set the stage for Egypt's greatest age yet. Because now Egypt wasn't just going to defend itself, it was going to build an empire. This is it, the New Kingdom, Egypt's most powerful era. The time of warrior pharaohs, monumental temples, and global influence. It begins with Amosai, who drives out the Hyksos and reunites Egypt. From there, pharaohs like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III transform Egypt into an empire stretching from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north. Thutmose III is often called the Napoleon of Egypt. He led 17 successful military campaigns, bringing back wealth, tribute, and prisoners of war. Egypt wasn't just defending itself, it was dominating the region. But not every pharaoh was about war. Hatshepsut, one of the most famous female rulers in history, focused on trade and building. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the most beautiful monuments of ancient Egypt. She sent trading expeditions to Punt, bringing back exotic goods like incense, gold, and even live trees to plant in her temple gardens. Then comes Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh. He tried to overturn centuries of tradition by worshipping just one god, Aten, the sun disk. This was the world's first attempt at monotheism. He even built a whole new capital, Akhenaten, dedicated to his new religion. But after his death, Egypt went back to the old gods, almost erasing his legacy. His son, Tutankhamun, King Tut, he became famous not for what he did, his reign was short, but because his tomb was discovered almost completely intact in 1922 by Howard Carter. That golden mask became the face of ancient Egypt. And then there's Ramses II, Ramses the Great. He ruled for 66 years, built more monuments than almost any other pharaoh, and fought the famous Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. The battle ended in a stalemate, but the peace treaty that followed is the earliest known in history. The New Kingdom also gave us massive temples, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel. These weren't just religious centers. They were showcases of power. Walls covered in inscriptions, towering statues, columns that still leave visitors speechless today. For over 500 years, the New Kingdom represented the peak of Egyptian civilization. Wealth, power, culture, Egypt had it all. But, as history always reminds us, no empire lasts forever. After Ramses and the New Kingdom, Egypt began to fracture again. Power shifted from the pharaohs to high priests in Thebes. Local rulers carved out territories. Egypt was politically divided and militarily weaker. This opened the door to outside powers. First Libyans settled and became rulers. Then Nubian kings from the south took control. Later, the Assyrians invaded, followed by the Persians. Egypt wasn't the dominant power anymore. It was the prize everyone else wanted. Culturally, Egypt still thrived. Temples were still being built, art continued, but the grandeur of the New Kingdom was gone. Egypt had become a shadow of its former self. And then, in 332 BCE, a new player entered the stage, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great swept into Egypt in 332 BCE, and here's the twist. The Egyptians welcomed him. Compared to Persian rule, Alexander looked like a liberator. He left Egypt in the hands of his general, Ptolemy, and from then on, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek kings and queens who adopted Egyptian traditions while keeping their Greek culture. This era gave us one of the most legendary institutions in history, the Library of Alexandria, a massive center of knowledge that collected scrolls from across the known world. Sadly, it was destroyed over time, but its legacy still inspires how we think about learning today. The Ptolemies ruled for nearly 300 years. Some were competent rulers, others not so much. But one stands above them all in fame, Cleopatra VII. Forget the Hollywood image of a seductress. Cleopatra was a skilled politician and diplomat. She spoke multiple languages, studied science and philosophy, and ruled in a time when Egypt was caught between two superpowers, Rome and the Parthian Empire. She formed an alliance with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony, trying to keep Egypt independent. But when Antony and Cleopatra lost to Octavian, the future Augustus, at the Battle of Actium, the end was sealed. In 30 BCE, Cleopatra took her own life. With her death, Egypt became a Roman province. The last pharaoh was gone. Over 3,000 years of independent Egyptian rule had ended. Under Rome, Egypt became the empire's breadbasket. The fertile Nile Valley produced grain that fed millions across the Mediterranean. Egypt was still culturally rich. Temples continued to be built, though on a smaller scale. Over time, Christianity spread here. By the 4th century CE, Alexandria had become one of the centers of Christian theology and debate. When Rome split, Egypt came under Byzantine control. But by now, it was no longer the master of its own fate. It was part of larger empires, valued for its resources, but losing its independence. That would change dramatically in the 7th century. In 641 CE, Arab armies swept into Egypt. Within a few years, the land of the pharaohs became part of the Islamic Caliphate. Arabic replaced the old languages, and Islam became the dominant religion. But Egypt thrived under this new identity. Cairo, founded in 969 CE, became a jewel of the Islamic world. It was a center of scholarship, trade, and architecture. Think of the great mosques, the bustling markets, the scholars writing texts that influenced the entire Middle East. For centuries, Egypt remained important. Eventually, in the 1500s, the Ottoman Empire took control. Egypt was still culturally vibrant, but politically, it was now just another province in someone else's empire. That remained the case until a French general named Napoleon showed up in 1798. Napoleon's invasion was short-lived, but it sparked something new: Western interest in ancient Egypt. His scholars documented temples, tombs, and monuments, kicking off modern Egyptology. In the 1800s, Muhammad Ali Pasha took control and modernized Egypt, reforming its army, economy, and education. His dynasty ruled for over a century. Then came the Suez Canal in 1869, a game-changer for global trade. But it also attracted British interest. By 1882, Britain had effectively taken control of Egypt, and it remained under British influence until the mid-20th century. Finally, in 1952, a revolution ended the monarchy and established a republic. Gamal Abdel Nasser became Egypt's leader, championing nationalism and independence. Since then, Egypt has faced challenges: wars with Israel, economic struggles, political upheavals, but it has also remained a cultural leader in the Arab world. Today, Egypt is home to over 100 million people, with Cairo as one of the largest cities on earth. And through it all, the legacy of ancient Egypt remains. Millions of tourists visit the pyramids each year. The Rosetta Stone unlocked the mysteries of hieroglyphs. Egyptian art, architecture, and culture continue to inspire us. From pharaohs to presidents, from pyramids to skyscrapers, Egypt's story isn't just about the past. It's about resilience, reinvention, and the enduring power of one of the world's oldest civilizations. And there you have it. 5,000 years of history, from the first farmers by the Nile to the modern nation we know today. Egypt's story isn't a straight line. It's a roller coaster. Golden ages, collapses, comebacks, invasions, revolutions. But through it all, Egypt has always mattered. Think about it. The pyramids still stand after 4,500 years. The literature of the Middle Kingdom still speaks to us. The Rosetta Stone unlocked an entire forgotten language. And Cleopatra's legend still fascinates us 2 millennia later. So the next time you see a picture of the pyramids, don't just think of them as old stones. Think of them as the opening chapter of human civilization. A reminder that long before Rome, long before Greece, long before us, there was Egypt. And in many ways, there still is. Thanks for coming on this journey. If you enjoyed exploring history like this, stick around, because there's always another story waiting to be told.